June 2, 2023, 5:40 a.m., Terminal D, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. The departure board exhales city names, and among them, Cairo. A 29-year-old Texas mother, worn down by her husband's night shifts and the silence of their apartment, holds a ticket like a promise to reclaim attention and the feeling of being beautiful. In 16 hours, she'll be met by a man she knows from hundreds of messages and dozens of video calls. But what begins as a reset vacation will turn into a windowless basement, unfamiliar voices behind the wall, and a message sent from her phone that makes her husband doubt everything. This story isn't about the exoticism of a country. It's about those who hide violence behind profiles and smiles. She grew up on the quiet edge of a Texas town, where backyards bled into open fields and trains sounded like distant thunder. Money was always counted twice, but birthdays were counted louder, with paper streamers and hand-mixed frosting. Her father kept a socket wrench in his pocket the way other men kept pens, and most evenings he came home with the smell of engine oil on his sleeves. Her mother worked mornings at a bakery and brought home extra rolls that did not sell, wrapped in brown paper and gratitude. On Saturdays, they opened every window and let the house fill with warm air and radio songs, pretending that summer itself had paid the light bill. In that small place, enough meant together, and together felt like wealth. She learned early that attention is a gift you earn by noticing others first. At school, she remembered names, birthdays, favorite colors, and the fact that one girl hid library finds in her shoe. Teachers trusted her to pass out worksheets and keep order when the bell ran late. She joined yearbook not because she loved cameras, but because it let her sit quietly at the edge of people's stories. By graduation, she had a box of programs, ticket stubs, and a private list of promises for the future. None of the promises mentioned money. They talked about steadiness, kindness, and a place to come home to at night. That list would follow her into adulthood like a folded prayer. College came through a community track that kept her close to family and the bakery's early morning leftovers. Between classes, she typed notes in a library that smelled like dust and printed dreams, measuring progress in highlighters and borrowed chargers. He first saw her there, and then again at a weekend baseball game where metal bleachers hummed under the crowd. He was practical in the way people are when they have worked since high school, careful with jokes and quicker with help. When he asked if she wanted coffee, he held the paper cup with both hands like it might spill their chance. They did not fall fast, they fell deliberately. Their first months looked like coupons and shared headphones, 2 paychecks orchestrated to meet in the middle. He worked construction and came home with sun lines etched along his cap's shadow. She pieced together shifts that fit around her classes and the bus schedule, always choosing routes with streetlights. On Fridays, they walked grocery aisles as if they were choosing a future, comparing labels and laughing when they put the same jar back on the shelf. The ring arrived in a season of rain, slipped on in a parking lot that smelled like asphalt and relief. They picked a wedding date by the calendar of time off and relatives who could travel. The wedding was small and honest, a rented hall with folding chairs and a borrowed speaker that cut out during the first dance. Her mother baked the cake, her father cried into a handkerchief he swore he did not need. Friends strung lights that made the room look bigger than it was, and for one night it felt like every corner of their lives was illuminated. They toasted with soda because the budget said no, and nobody minded because the music carried them. When they left, someone tied cans to the bumper that rattled all the way down the road. They drove past fields that held the dark like a secret and believed they could keep anything safe. Their apartment was the top floor of a building with thin walls and a balcony that caught morning heat. She arranged thrift store frames into a gallery of beginnings. First apartment key, first pay stub pinned behind glass, first recipe they managed without burning. On the refrigerator door, sticky notes layered like shingles kept track of bills, deadlines, and small victories. The couch came from a neighbor who said it had good bones, and they laughed about how a couch could have bones at all. They made space for a future that would not fit on a floor plan. Hope became a habit, practiced daily. When their daughter arrived, the whole map of their days redrew itself around feedings and laundry cycles. She was small and immediate, a gravity that pulled both parents toward the crib's wooden bars. He arranged his shifts to cover doctor appointments and nights when the baby would not settle. She learned an economy of motion only new parents understand, measuring time in ounces and nap windows. The apartment filled with soft sounds and new objects, each one a promise to keep someone beloved safe. The cracked balcony became a weather station for burp cloths and tiny socks. They were not wealthy, but they were precise about love, and precision made the days feel reliable. Mornings began with cereal and the news turned low. Evenings ended with dishes stacked like tidy columns. When the baby smiled, they repaid every doubt they had borrowed from themselves the week before. Gifts came from consignment shops and people who remembered how expensive first years can be. In late summer, they carried a fan from room to room and made a game of chasing the coolest air. They told each other that stability was a staircase, not a ladder, and they were climbing it together. As the baby grew, the rhythm of life assembled itself around work schedules and the daycare that trusted them with payment plans. He picked up overtime to keep the numbers honest. She learned to stretch leftovers into second chances. Weekends were for parks, hand-me-down strollers, and the kind of tired that felt earned. Family dropped by with casseroles that tasted like care and opinions that sounded like weather forecasts. They watched friends move to bigger places and did not envy them so much as take notes. "We'll get there," they said, and believed it. On quiet weeknights, after bedtime, she found herself lingering at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done. The apartment's hum wrapped around her, a neighbor's TV, a pipe's complaint, the old fridge clearing its throat. She scrolled past recipes, parenting tips, and photos of places she had never seen, saving more than she would ever try. Attention came in tiny doses there, a like, a comment, a name that reappeared under different posts. It felt harmless, manageable, something to keep the edges of loneliness from sharpening. She promised herself it was just a way to feel part of a larger room. What defined her then was not longing but diligence, the daily practice of showing up for the people she loved. She tracked immunization cards and coupon codes with the same care, each small act a brick in a wall against uncertainty. When friends asked how she was, she answered with logistics and gratitude, holding the complicated parts behind her teeth. She believed in the fixable and the soon, in calendars that could be rearranged to make more space. Her world was compact and luminous, made of errands and tiny triumphs that nobody outside the apartment would notice. In that measured life, her kindness remained the most expensive thing she owned. There is a particular strength that grows in houses where cinnamon covers for stress and laughter covers for light bills. It is the strength of people who keep going because the alternative feels like betrayal. She carried that strength like a quiet credential, not to be displayed, only to be used when necessary. On most days, necessity meant nothing more than patience and a second wind. On most days, her story was a small and beautiful one, written in washable marker and wiped clean each night. And on most days, that was enough. On weeknights, the apartment settled into its predictable hush, the kind that arrives after dishes dry and a child's breathing evens out. She wiped the table, stacked lunch containers for tomorrow, and checked the door chain out of habit rather than worry. The clock over the stove clicked its minute hand forward as if to remind her that small lives keep steady time. With the chores done, the room had no more requests to make of her, and the silence started to feel like a presence. She opened her laptop, not for escape, but for company measured in light and motion. The blue glow was a stand-in for voices she did not want to bother at that hour. Her feed had become a map of things she might try one day: thrifted bookshelves, 5-ingredient dinners, playgrounds a bus ride away. She joined a group for mothers in Texas and another for people who collect second-hand children's clothes, then lingered over a travel page where members posted cloudy sunsets from places she could name but not locate on a real atlas. Comments were easy currency there, small acknowledgments, a little warmth sent into rooms she would never enter. The algorithm learned quickly that she liked helpful strangers and pictures of water. It began to return the favor with more of both. That was the night she noticed a photo of a riverside promenade lit like a string of coins. His name sat below the image, familiar only because it began to repeat. He wrote the way careful people speak, with soft edges and no demands, answering questions in full paragraphs rather than fragments. Beneath someone's post about travel safety, he added a note about how visitors often miss the quieter neighborhoods and how all cities are better when seen early in the morning. He was not selling anything, and that felt like proof of sincerity in a place where so much was performance. She scrolled past, then scrolled back to see if anyone had challenged him. No one had, and he moved on like a person who knows patience is its own advertisement. Their first exchange contained nothing memorable until she realized she had replied without thinking twice. He had asked about Texas heat, of all things, joking that desert people admire those who live inside ovens. She answered with a photo of a dashboard thermometer from July and a line about how fans migrate from room to room like pets. He reacted with a simple laugh and a question about her favorite month of the year. It registered as ordinary courtesy, and that was why it worked. Ordinary has a way of disarming people who are tired of being impressed at. Small patterns formed before she named them, his replies landing in her notifications at the same late hour. He did not push the conversation forward so much as hold it open, leaving just enough space for her to enter when she wanted. The first private message was about a recipe she had shared in a group thread and how a similar dish was cooked along a river he loved. She typed back with substitutions she used when the budget demanded it. He returned with a photo of a kitchen counter arranged neatly enough to suggest intention. She noticed the neatness and told herself it meant nothing beyond good housekeeping. Video remained theoretical until he suggested it as a way to show her a market that could not be photographed without losing sound and motion. The invitation came with handouts, with an understanding that schedules change and cameras can stay off. She checked the baby monitor, then her reflection in the dark laptop screen, then accepted because it felt safer to see a person's eyes than to write to a bubble with initials. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, full of vendor voices and slow panning shots, and ended with a polite wave. Afterward, the apartment felt louder, as if the fridge had decided to protest being ignored. She put the laptop away and folded laundry with an attention usually reserved for new clothes. Boundary lines moved in increments that did not trip alarms. She told him about the thrift store where children's books cost $1 on Wednesdays, and about the bus stop that floods during heavy rain. He told her about a bridge that looks ordinary until you stand under it at midday and notice how the light makes a pattern on the water. She sent a picture of a playground slide, he sent one of an old stone wall. Each exchange landed like a small, guiltless presence in a day already claimed by responsibilities. When she caught herself waiting for his reply, she framed it as curiosity rather than attachment. Words are easier to manage than feelings when you get to choose the order they arrive in. The attention he gave her was steady, not loud, and steadiness is persuasive when life is built from schedules. He remembered details without calling attention to the remembering, asking later how the pink-handled scissors held up or whether the fan still rattled in the hallway at night. She noticed that he never interrupted, not even by text, letting her finish a thought before he offered one of his own. When he complimented her, he chose competence over beauty, which felt both rarer and safer. She told herself that this was what friendship looked like for people who met after bedtime. Friendship is a generous word that can hold many shapes if no one squeezes too hard. There were moments when she considered telling her husband, then filed the idea away under timing and context. Their schedules overlapped like layers of tracing paper, translucent but rarely aligned. When he got home, the first order of business was sleep or a shower. When she was ready to talk, he was ready to leave again. She did not hide the laptop so much as refrain from offering a full inventory of her evening. Omission is not always a secret in houses where time runs lean. That is how she explained it to herself when the explanation was needed. The platform made secrecy easy by calling it privacy. It encouraged separate circles and customized notifications and reminded users that boundaries can be drawn with a click. She set her phone to silent after 9 and told herself it was a healthy practice. She moved their conversations into a folder that required an extra step, a decision that felt like candor because she had named it. Steps create the illusion of process, and process often passes for caution. She liked the feeling of control more than she disliked the fact that she needed to exercise it. He suggested books and songs and videos with timestamps, framing each recommendation as a thing they could talk about later. Later became a place they visited most nights, a small room built out of links and a camera with kind angles. He asked about her daughter's favorite story and whether bedtime changed when the moon was bright. She asked about the sounds that came through his window at dawn. They compared mornings and found them both familiar and foreign. Similarity can be as binding as difference when people are tired of being alone in their days. When she looked back on those weeks from a safer distance, she would try to identify the exact moment when attention became attachment. She would search for a sentence that crossed a line, or a glance that lasted too long, a catalyst she could label and learn from. At the time, there was no single moment, only 1,000 small ones lined up like beads, easy to thread when you tell yourself the string is strong. She told herself many things that were not untrue, but also not complete. Partial truths are durable. They survive because they agree with what we need most. That is how ordinary evenings turn into habits that feel like choices. If there were warnings, they did not look like warning signs. They looked like courtesy and availability and the patient way he let quiet sit between messages without trying to fill it with himself. They looked like competence, knowing which streets were safe after dark, which museums were less crowded, which phone plans worked abroad. When he mentioned the idea of showing her the parts of the city tourists don't see, it sounded like hospitality rather than opportunity. She nodded at the screen because it was easier than saying she did not know what she wanted. The monitor showed the baby asleep and the bars on the signal strong, and that, for the moment, was enough. The decision formed slowly and then all at once, the way a forecast becomes weather when you finally step outside. She framed it as a break, a week to reset the parts of herself numbed by schedules and fluorescent lights. They spoke about vacations in the abstract many times, always postponing for money or timing, and this time she brought a date. June, before the worst heat and after a set of deadlines that had boxed them in for months. She said the trip was a promise to come back lighter, easier to live with, better for all of them. He listened with the tired caution of someone counting hours before the next shift. Logistics made the plan feel responsible rather than impulsive. She found a round-trip fare that fit their budget if they accepted a long layover and an early departure. A friend agreed to help with daycare pickups on 2 days that would otherwise break the schedule. She printed an itinerary and clipped it to a folder labeled with her maiden name, because that is how her passports read. They checked calendars like negotiators, lining up obligations until a narrow corridor of time appeared. In that corridor, a week looked almost reasonable. When she told him the destination, she chose her words carefully. She emphasized museums and markets and the famous river, letting the romance of old stones do some of the talking. He did not ask how the location had made its way from her screen into their kitchen, and she did not volunteer that part. Trust, in their house, often meant accepting the edited version when the unedited one would only make the day heavier. He asked for a promise to check in every night, and she made it easily because she believed it would be easy to keep. They folded the conversation closed the way people do when the next task is already calling. She booked a modest hotel with good reviews near a street that kept appearing in his photos. The map showed it close enough to walk to major sites, far enough to avoid crowds at night. She emailed the property about airport pickup, then forwarded the confirmation to her husband as evidence that this was a trip with edges and plans. He replied with a thumbs up and a line about bringing home stories for their daughter. She added the reservation to a color-coded calendar and felt organized in a way that calms worry. Organized is a word that can carry more meaning than it seems to. He offered to pay part of the fare, and she let him, both of them grateful for the symbolism of shared cost. They sat with the numbers a while longer and found enough to cover a museum pass and an extra data plan. She bought a guidebook from a used shop and highlighted pages like a student before an exam. He circled the embassy address and wrote it on a card to tuck behind her ID, a habit inherited from a father who believed in backups. They smiled at each other in a tired way that meant thank you without using the words. It was the kind of domestic truce that keeps ordinary lives intact. Her online friend surfaced as a resource rather than a reason. He sent practical notes about SIM cards, taxis, and which bank ATMs were less likely to stall on foreign cards. He recommended a walking route that would avoid tour buses and promised to point out a cafe where the coffee was better than the view. She accepted these details as if they came from a forum, not a person, and told herself she would keep the formal tours for the big landmarks. He said that if schedules aligned, he could show her the parts most visitors miss, and she stored that offer with the museum hours and bus maps. It felt like information, not invitation. Departure day arrived with the early morning quiet that makes airports feel like train stations in old movies. She packed light, 2 dresses, flats, a scarf, and a small bottle of familiar shampoo to ground her senses somewhere known. Her husband drove her to the terminal and parked illegally long enough to carry the heavier bag inside. They said the kinds of things people say when they will be apart but do not want to dramatize it. He kissed her forehead and told her to text when she cleared security. She promised again, shouldered the bag, and let the crowd carry her forward. The flight was a long coil of hours, measured by beverage carts and the steady flicker of route maps on seatback screens. She wrote a list of souvenirs to keep her hands busy. Stickers for their daughter, a wooden toy boat, maybe spices if customs would allow it. When the cabin darkened, she watched a documentary with closed captions and slept in narrow slices between announcements. In the quiet moments, she pictured the river at dusk and the way old stone absorbs heat, then releases it like a breath. She did not picture herself on camera next to someone who knew exactly where the blind corners were. Expectation is a lens that decides what gets to be in frame. Arrival unfolded with the usual choreography: immigration lines, baggage carousels, unfamiliar overhead signs translated by context more than fluency. A driver held her name on a white card near the exit, and she felt the comfort of recognition in a place where nothing else recognized her. The ride skimmed along wide roads into tighter streets, past billboards that came alive after dark. She sent a photo through the car window to her husband with a quick note: "Landed, safe, more later." He replied with a heart and a question about the time difference. The car slowed near her hotel, and the city exhaled into her room. The first day drew a careful line between ordinary tourism and the allure of local knowledge. She took her guidebook to breakfast and circled what she could walk to before noon. He messaged with a suggestion for an afternoon market that would be easier to manage with someone who knew the vendors. She agreed to meet in a public square she had already seen on the map. He arrived on time with bottled water and an itinerary he presented as a courtesy. They kept a polite distance as they moved through the crowd. By nightfall, the city felt both vast and navigable, a paradox that made her braver than she would have been at home. He knew an overlook with a view of lights that looked like sequins poured across fabric, and she let the sight convince her that some risks are only stories told by cautious people. When he spoke, he named alleys like friends and referred to the river with the familiarity of someone who grew up tracing it with a finger on maps. She noticed how easily vendors deferred to him and assumed it was because he greeted them in a way tourists rarely do. That assumption was comfortable and therefore unchallenged. Comfort can be persuasive enough to pass for truth. On the second day, he proposed a route that would be impossible without local shortcuts, promising fewer lines and better photos. She had planned to take a paid tour for the same sites, but the offer carried the efficiency of someone who had tested the path. He mentioned a registration form required at one stop and the need to copy passport details to expedite things. She said she would bring the document and keep it in her bag. He nodded and said there would be a point when handing it to him would save time, but only if she felt comfortable. The word comfortable did most of the work. By the third morning, their pattern had enough repetition to feel like routine. He checked on timing, she confirmed the day's goals, and he adjusted their path to account for weather and crowds. She texted her husband between sites with photos and short updates that could stand alone without context. Everything she sent was true as far as it went. When he asked whether she was getting enough rest, she replied that the city runs on momentum and she had borrowed some. The truth can be a partial witness and still sound complete. The invitation to meet his family came folded into a day that had already gone well. They had made their way through crowded lanes, and he had smoothed the path with a word here, a nod there, the way locals do when a city has learned to trust them. He mentioned a short stop before dinner, nothing formal, just tea and introductions. She agreed because small rituals often prove a place is real, not just a collection of photos. The sun had begun its slow tilt toward evening, and the air softened in a way that makes choices feel lighter. She texted a quick update and put her phone back where she could reach it without looking. The drive left the broad avenues behind and slipped into narrower streets where the rhythm of traffic changed. Storefronts gave way to shuttered doors, and the chatter of vendors thinned until it became a background hum. He kept talking, pointing out landmarks that registered only as shapes through the window. She watched the blue dot on her map fall behind and told herself that phones are better with main roads than with side ones. The cars stopped in a courtyard that felt shared rather than owned, the kind of space where a dozen families might pass without introducing themselves. He said the place would look different upstairs, then did not hurry her as she stepped out. Inside the stairwell, the air cooled and carried the clean smell of stone that has been washed more than once a day. The walls were recent paint, not new, and someone had hung a strand of plastic flowers halfway up as if to mark a celebration that never quite ended. She kept her hand on the rail and her bag on the shoulder closest to the wall, a small travel habit learned from forums and reinforced by common sense. He walked ahead, but not so far that she had to raise her voice to ask a question. They paused on a landing while he made a brief call and said something too quickly for her to follow. When the door opened, 3 men filled the frame without being impolite about it. Their faces did not threaten so much as no longer perform welcome. One of them held a tray of glasses, another lifted a curtain to let in evening light, and the third stood aside the way a person stands aside when they expect to be passed. She stepped in because stepping back would have been a decision, and she was not ready to commit to decisions. The latch clicked once, clean and final, the way latches do when they are well maintained. He said his mother was not home yet, but his uncles were, and they were pleased to meet her. The room was cool and spare, with low chairs and no clutter, as if it had been reset for a photograph. In that measured space, she realized how little she knew about his life beyond the camera's angle. The pretext arrived with the ease of someone who has practiced it. He asked for her passport to register the visit with a neighborhood office, a common practice, he said, to smooth over any questions about foreigners in private homes. She hesitated without being dramatic, touching the zipper on her bag and drawing a line she could still step over. He did not press. He let the moment sit until one of the men made a show of turning on the television and flipping past a news channel. She remembered the times he had anticipated small needs, a bottle of water at the right minute, a seat before she asked, and mistook familiarity for safety. When she handed the passport across, he took it with 2 hands and a sentence about being right back. She tried the couch, then the chair by the window, then the seat closest to the door, as if proximity might translate to permission. The men kept a rotation of small tasks that made them look busy without doing anything. A kettle boiled and then did not pour. A phone lit up and then face down again. She sent a message that said, "Here now, quick tea, then dinner," and followed it with a photograph of a view that did not include the entrance. The reply came back with a heart and a request for one more picture if the light cooperated. She took one and set the phone where she could see the screen without calling attention to herself. When he returned, his voice had been repainted. He spoke the same words but at a different temperature, quiet enough that she had to lean in to hear the parts that mattered. He said the neighborhood office wanted her to wait until morning, a small delay he framed as an annoyance shared between them. She suggested getting the passport back and registering somewhere near her hotel instead. He stepped just close enough that her own suggestion began to sound combative even to her. He said the office kept the documents overnight by policy, that they would deliver them early, that this was routine. Routine is a powerful word for people who do not want to make a scene. The first boundary to fall was movement. He asked her to sit in a different room to avoid the evening crowd that would soon gather on the landing. The second boundary was sound. He closed the door and said the street had a habit of listening when it was bored. The third was time, measured by a thin watch on his wrist that seemed to skip minutes whenever she checked it. She noted these changes the way a passenger notes turbulence, quietly, trusting the plane to level out. She stood once and said she preferred waiting in the front room where the window let in air. He said the window was dusty and offered to bring the air instead. That was when she asked for her passport again and called him by a name she had used with ease the day before. He told the truth in a way that left no useful edges. He was not the person he had presented, not exactly, though parts were accurate enough to pass a casual audit. He said this arrangement was temporary and necessary, that everything depended on cooperation, that her welfare mattered to him because of what he had already invested. She understood the words but not the structure that held them together. In the hall, there was the sound of a bolt sliding in a lock that might have been theirs or someone else's. He promised that no one would touch her if she followed instructions, and the promise sounded like a favor he was granting himself. The men did not look at her. They looked at him to see how the next minutes would go. The descent was not dramatic. It began with a suggestion to wait where it was cooler, continued with a hand pointing to stairs that did not belong to the living space, and ended with a doorway whose threshold had been worn by other feet. The room below smelled like bleach and something metallic that was not metal. There were mats on the floor and a shelf with water in reused bottles, and the air moved only when someone else moved first. Two other women sat against the far wall, not huddled, not spread out, establishing the exact distance that says we are strangers who recognize each other's shape. One looked up and then away, the other did not change anything about her posture. She introduced herself and received names that may or may not have been true. Information arrived out of order and with missing nouns. One woman said passports went upstairs and came back only with people who were leaving. Another said the lights stayed on at night because darkness made people talk. A third voice from behind the partial wall described a list written on the back of a folded brochure. She tried to build a sequence from these pieces and failed. The room was organized to defeat time. No clock, no window, meals without schedule, questions that returned from different mouths with the same answers. When footsteps sounded overhead, conversations closed like books in a library when the lights flick. She inventoried the space the way a person does when they need the map to be small enough to hold in the mind. The vents were high and horizontal, controlled by screws that did not match. The door had a latch and a lock, both on the wrong side. A camera in the corner watched without blinking, a red eye covered by clear tape to keep it honest. She found the bathroom by counting doorways and stepped inside to discover there was nowhere to put a question without hearing it land. Back on the mat, she thought about the word safe and how easily it can change its job. A reassurance one day, a measurement the next. She tried to slow her breathing because panic is loud. When he came back with a tray and an explanation, it was both more and less than she expected. He said she needed rest and that the city would look kinder in the morning. He placed water within reach and stood where the camera could see him put it down. She asked for her phone and received it with the charge below 50% and the notifications cleared. He suggested sending one message now to avoid concern later and dictated language that would sound like her, a trick anyone who reads long enough can learn. She wrote that she was fine and that she would be in touch when the connection improved. He waited for the send receipt and then stepped back as if to give the room permission to exhale. The door closed with a sound she would later remember better than most conversations. On the other side, footsteps receded into a rhythm that would become familiar if she let it. She looked at the other two women and found no answers there, just a shared understanding that this was the part where options narrow. She checked the corners again, because checking corners is something to do. Then she tried to sleep without setting an alarm, because time was no longer hers to manage. Morning and night lost their names first. Downstairs, time ran on cues that did not belong to her. The rhythm of shoes above, the metallic clank of a lock, the pause before a tray touched the floor. Lights stayed on when they should have dimmed, and dimmed when her body wanted morning. The women learned to build small rituals out of what remained, counting sips, folding and refolding a scarf, tracing grout lines to measure calm. She memorized the sound of footsteps that meant water, and the different cadence that meant questions. It helped to name things, even if the names moved. Communication arrived as a condition, not a kindness. On the second day, he handed over her phone with the battery half full and said she could send one text that would prevent unnecessary attention. He stood where the camera could see both of them and spoke in the tone he used for logistics, not threats. She wrote that she was tired from travel and would go offline until the connection improved, then sent a photo at his suggestion, a riverside shot from earlier in the week cropped to show her shoulder and the edge of another person face out of frame. He watched for the delivery check mark as if it were a receipt. The phone left with him and the room inhaled again. At home, the message landed like a coin tossed on a scale that was already tipping. Her husband had filed a missing person report after the first night without contact, a decision he made because ordinary explanations could not cover the hours anymore. The text did not sound wrong, but it did not sound entirely like her either. Something in the syntax carried a weight she did not usually put there. He went back over their last calls and found nothing dramatic, only a tired optimism and a list of places she meant to see. He sent back a simple reply, "Love you, check in when you can," and did not mention the cropped face. Quiet suspicion is a kind of mercy when facts are scarce. The days that followed divided into tasks she set for herself and tasks set by others. She kept a mental log of sounds that drifted down the stairwell, a radio announcer's cadence, a vendor's shout at the same hour, the 5 calls to prayer that could be mapped to clock time if she were certain of the city. In the bathroom, she looked for labels on cleaning bottles and found them tealed off. The food trays carried nothing unique, but once a paper napkin arrived with a faint stamp that suggested a street name. She tried to memorize the letters and then forgot one, the way you forget a word when you clutch it too tightly. At night, she reviewed the list until it blurred. He managed the room with procedures that felt designed to appear reasonable. He made a point of returning the phone every few days for a single controlled message and suggested phrases that would keep questions small. When she asked for her passport, he promised a timeline without naming a date. When she asked to call the hotel, he said the desk would only alarm them and that alarms invite officials who make simple things complicated. He told the women upstairs were temporary, that arrangements change quickly when everyone cooperates. None of it was shouted, and that made it harder to push against. Pressure with manners can feel like permission if you let it. Her husband widened the circle of people who knew without widening the circle of people who would gossip. He called the airline to confirm return dates, the hotel to ask if she had checked out, the credit card company to see where charges had posted. A travel group she followed pinned his notice near the top, and messages began to arrive, most kind, some wild, a few that echoed urban legends. He printed the useful ones and set the rest aside because belief is a resource he needed to spend carefully. He learned about embassy hours and what welfare and whereabouts checks look like when done across languages and agencies. Waiting became a series of deliberate actions performed between calls. Online, patterns began to surface that no single account could have shown. A woman in another forum described a man who took photos that were always cropped at the chin and spoke in paragraphs that sounded considerate even when he was asking for something. Someone else recognized the riverside in the picture she had sent and noted which cafes along that stretch served bottled water with labels that looked like the one in her hand. None of this was proof, and everyone said so. Still, the coincidence of details built a scaffold that could hold a theory. He forwarded the threads to the consular email with a subject line that kept the tone factual. Downstairs, she started to pay attention to the errors that routines inevitably make. One afternoon, the man who brought water forgot to close the upper grate all the way, leaving a thin draft that smelled like tobacco and sun-heated stone. On another, the tray included a plastic fork stamped with a supplier's initial she had not seen before. Once, when the door opened sooner than usual, she heard a name spoken in annoyance and filed it next to the partial street stamp on the napkin. She shared what she had with the other women in the calm tone they all had adopted, and they compared notes the way students prepare for different versions of the same test. Building a map out of crumbs kept their minds active and their fear on a shorter leash. The second message was the one that made everything worse before it made anything better. He drafted it for her, saying it would buy time and stop outside interference. Tell them you need space, that you met someone, that you will explain when you return. She resisted and then negotiated, changing verbs, softening the claim, trying to keep the sentence hers. The photo he paired it with showed a corner of the market where they had walked on her second day, and a hand near her shoulder that could have belonged to anyone. When it reached her husband, it snapped something gentle inside him and replaced it with something harder. He refused to let that hardness steer the search, but it altered how others heard him. Friends divided themselves without meaning to. Some insisted she had the right to be complicated and to want more than a life carved by budgets and shifts. Others saw betrayal where he barely saw a breadcrumb and asked whether he was sure he wanted to find a person who might not want to be found. He kept the focus on logistics: immigration stamps, hotel logs, camera coverage near the square where she had last checked in. He gave the same information to strangers that he would have given to detectives if they had called for it. He was learning, in real time, how to be both patient and relentless. She asked for a call, and he offered a compromise, a recording she could make in one take, no need to repeat herself. He handed her the phone with the camera covered and the timer running. She spoke in the awkward present tense of people who are trying to sound fine and make a code at the same time. She put stress on words that did not need it and hoped someone at home would hear the stress as something other than fatigue. When she finished, he took the phone and nodded as if they had completed a task on a list. The women listened to her breathing stabilize and did not comment. Weeks collected like receipts she would never submit. She traced the vent screws again and counted the calls to prayer and stopped trying to sleep in long stretches. She thought of her daughter's mourning face, the way it changes when a parent walks in, and learned to hold the picture without breaking on it. She studied the men's schedule and found a moment most days when the upstairs landing went quiet and the radio below flickered through static. She began to plan, not in the cinematic way of people who believe escape comes from one heroic act, but in the practical way of people who understand that chance is only helpful if you recognize it. On the 60th day, or what she later labeled the 60th, because numbers comfort people who want a record, a misalignment opened. The man with water was late, someone shouted upstairs in a voice she had not heard before, and the door closed without the usual second lock catching. She waited the length of 2 prayers and a news jingle before moving toward the hall. The grate above was not closed all the way, and a narrow line of light drew a map on the wall. She took the note she had rewritten in her head for weeks, pressed it into the gap with a button from her sleeve as a weight, and watched it lift and stall and lift again. Somewhere beyond, a smaller life going about its business might find paper where there should be none. The message itself was simple, a list rather than a plea. Her name and age, a U.S. number for a consular duty officer, the partial street name from the napkin, the hour when shoes were loudest, the sound of a generator that matched a brand she could describe. She did not add fear, because people who act on found notes need instructions more than feelings. Then she returned to the mat and waited for the day to close in the usual ways, daring only to adjust her breathing. Upstairs, a chair scraped the floor in the pattern she had come to expect. If help was coming, it would not announce itself. If it was not, the room would keep its shape. In both possibilities, she would be ready to move when the next seam opened. The paper did not find a hero so much as a routine that noticed. A boy in flip-flops sweeping a landing saw it first. A corner trembling in a draft that should not have existed. He tugged it free, read the numbers he could, and recognized the English words that repeat in movies. He carried it to the vegetable stall where his uncle kept a radio loud enough to drown worry. The uncle had seen notes like this in stories and not in life, which is often how action begins. He folded the paper twice and walked it to a shopkeeper who knew a police officer with a cousin at an NGO. The call did not set off sirens. It set off conversations. The NGO worker listened, asked for the paper to be photographed, and texted a contact at the consulate. The consular duty officer logged the details in a tone that sounded like bureaucracy to outsiders and like urgency to those who understand how systems protect themselves. They requested a welfare check through local authorities and shared what could be shared without endangering the person who had risked a note through a grate. Meanwhile, the boy kept sweeping the same square of floor because some tasks steady the hands after a decision. Everyone involved had learned that speed must dress like caution if it wants to pass through doors. Downstairs, she noticed the difference first as silence, then as layers of sound arranging themselves into intent. Footsteps above did not match the usual pattern. They came in short pairs followed by pauses, notes written in boots instead of pens. The radio near the entrance jumped station, then cut out entirely. She told the other women in a voice used by people who do not want to wake sleeping children. They moved to the places they had decided were safest, not because safety can be guaranteed, but because a plan calms the body. Plans are a kind of prayer in rooms where clocks do not belong. When the lock turned, it did so twice, and the second turn belonged to a different hand. A voice announced itself in formal language, the kind that assumes someone is listening behind more than one door. He arrived at the threshold a beat later, posture rewired into cooperation, phrases pre-polished for plausible complexities. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that timing had conspired against good intentions, that documentation was being processed as they spoke. The officer answered with procedure, not opinion, and asked to see the women where they were. Procedure is a shield when stories begin to multiply. The room expanded the way a chest expands when air returns. Light from the hall found corners that had practiced being invisible. She gave her name and age in a voice that kept tripping over gratitude it could not yet afford. One woman asked for water first, and the officer nodded because good checks start with small mercies. They were counted, names written, photographs avoided, and the door stayed open while the conversation moved. Above them, a different door slammed, and the building changed register from domestic to administrative. Extraction happens in pieces when done correctly. They left 2 at a time to reduce attention on the stairwell and used the landing to separate conversation from movement. Someone placed a light jacket over her shoulders as if a garment could stitch torn hours back together. On the street, a car idled in a lane that was not a lane, and the boy with the broom stood on the far side pretending to admire a poster. She did not look for him because sometimes gratitude is safest when it stays unsaid. Another car pulled away faster than traffic allowed, and the officer did not watch it go. At the station, the questions were deliberate and narrow, designed to build a picture without inviting speculation to stand in for detail. She described the room in measurements of footsteps and the sequence of sounds that marked meals. She said the names she had collected and offered a folded napkin with a partial stamp that might tether a story to a street. The other women gave their versions, and places overlapped in ways that suggested a network rather than a single apartment. The officer wrote it all down and did not expose his reactions to the air. Reactions have a way of becoming evidence if left unattended. The consular office felt like a pocket of air in a building that had forgotten to breathe. A staffer offered tea and a phone and the quiet to use both. She called home and said the sentence people say when they know the listener has been keeping the world upright by will alone: "I am safe." He asked too many questions at once, and then apologized as if the apology could erase the overlap. She answered what she could and promised the rest when the room was larger. Their daughter's voice arrived as a background, a shape moving past a doorway, and she had to sit down to keep the floor from bending. News travels quickly when it wears the right badge. Local groups posted warnings without pictures, careful to remove gossip and keep instructions. The hotel clerk who had noticed a quiet checkout filed the detail with the police in a tone that sounded like regret. The NGO reached out to other forums where similar stories had been whispered and found that whispers, when collected, carry weight. Information circled back to the same corner of the city with new edges. Upstairs, the apartment door stayed locked to everyone who did not have a reason to be there. They did not find him. Accounts associated with his name vanished the way careful accounts do, deactivated rather than deleted, leaving gaps that can look like errors instead of exits. A neighbor remembered a suitcase carried at an odd hour and a taxi that did not use its meter. A vendor swore he had not seen the man in days, and then remembered he had, but somewhere else, at a time that evaporated under follow-up. Networks built for profit are also built for disappearance. The same skills that make recruitment efficient make retreat clean. The men in the room upstairs were identified, then unidentified, then called in under other names. Re-entry did not feel like a door opening. It felt like a hallway that had to be walked in careful steps. She gave statements more than once, because systems prefer repetition to improvisation, and repetition steadies memory. Medical checks documented what needed documenting, and left the rest to counselors trained to hold stories without breaking them further. Home was not a single arrival, but a set of arrivals. First to a bed that smelled like detergent she recognized, then to a kitchen where the light fell the right way at 5, then to a laughter that sounded like it had been kept in a jar for safekeeping. The child counted the days differently, in sleeps and snacks, and forgave without understanding the word for it. Forgiveness is a thing small people do easily when big people remember how to be dependable. After, she learned to speak about prevention without turning her life into a warning label. She told friends to insist on video calls before commitments, to verify bookings with hotels directly, to keep scanned documents where passwords are long and memorable. She suggested a panic code disguised as ordinary language, the kind of phrase a spouse would recognize even if no one else did. She kept her passport in a place where love could not borrow it and called that rule non-negotiable. The platforms that had held their early messages became tools she used with gloves on. Trust returned in centimeters and did not apologize for its pace. For others watching from a distance, this story will try to become a lesson about countries or borders, but that would be the wrong lesson. The right one is about people who turn profiles into traps and routines into nets, and about people who keep pulling at seams until doors open. It is about the weight of a single note pushed through a gap, and the way strangers carry it forward without ceremony. And it is about families who choose steadiness when certainty is not available yet. If this account helped you see the shape of risk more clearly, consider sharing it with someone who scrolls alone at night. Attention saves more often than fear does, and small safeguards multiply when spoken out loud.